Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We have a current issues panel with us today, a regular feature here on the show. And today we are going to hit a variety of stories, including controversial ad campaigns by fashion houses. We're going to discuss one Ontario hospital network considering, out of desperation, hiring healthcare workers who did not receive the COVID shots. And speaking of COVID, we'll cover a data breach of Ontarians' information from the COVID booking line. Lots to discuss. And joining me now to unpack it all is political commentator Brock Stephenson and Elliot Hughes, senior advisor at Summa Strategies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Always fun to have this panel because we cover so many interesting things. Let's talk about this Ontario hospital that's considering, again, operative word considering, hiring back unvaccinated healthcare workers. And to be clear, that's who did not receive the COVID-2 shots. Maybe we'll start with you, Brock. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think this is a starter?
I think the overreach has been a problem throughout the first 2 years of the corona pandemic in Canada. And I think we've got a challenge throughout the system for the healthcare workers' own well-being. They probably should consider getting their shots, but this is a dilemma that's bigger than them. There's a staffing shortage that's been going on for years due to poor planning, shortage of spaces in universities throughout the country. And this is the result you get. Corona just compounds the challenge.
Elliot, what do you think? Do you think those who refuse to comply with the government's edict, do you think they should be allowed to be hired back?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think we're in a very different place than we were a year and a half, 2 years ago. If you put yourself back then, we really didn't have a good sense of, how Corona moved, how serious it was. And so we've learned a lot since then. We've also seen as Brock mentioned, the healthcare system in Ontario and Canada, frankly, is in really rough shape, and we need every help that we can get. And so, to Brock's point again, obviously for the health and safety of those healthcare workers, hopefully they decide to protect themselves a little bit more and use and get some of the shots. If they don't, then that's something that they're going to have to take on themselves and take that risk. But I think any extra set of hands to help out these days to sort of backfill some of the work these healthcare workers have been doing and get some new shifts in there, I think would be very much welcome by everybody.
Well, I'm curious as to how. Well, I have perhaps a little bit of an insight. I spoke to a parent of one of these healthcare workers who was vaccine mandated out in Ontario. And I said I was going to cover this topic today. And she said, well, I don't know if they want to go back. She said, you don't understand. For the first 2 years, they worked themselves silly, thinking that they were sacrificing, that they're putting themselves in harm's way, working directly in the ICU with these COVID units. And now they feel like they were just cast by the wayside. Do you think, Brock, if these workers were to be rehired or if they were allowed to come back, do you think they will? And if so, what about back pay?
I think they're getting back pay, but I do think some of them will go back. Some of them clearly are victims of the system where the 10% that didn't get vaccinated were ostracized and pushed to the corner of Canadian society. The federal government especially pushed them aside. I think that this is part of the challenge. But we have a shortage of healthcare personnel, and the provinces and the federal government need to work together, step up, and find more doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers to fix this problem so that we don't have it this way for the next 15, 20 years.
And Elliot, do you think this will maybe expand beyond this one Southwestern Ontario hospital network? I mention this because we've seen it in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and the Yukon. They have all lifted the restrictions for healthcare workers. Ontario, again, very major populous province, 1/3 of the country lives here. They're not lifting it yet. Neither is Quebec, nor has British Columbia. Do you think Ontario will be the first to lead the way in lifting this policy?
I wouldn't be surprised, and I think that change is probably coming. It might be a bit tough for the Premier to make that call at the moment. We're probably entering into a bit of a push in terms of COVID rates and just general challenges in the medical system, and I guess there's a question in that fine balance for the Premier to strike. I do, however, think that in the spring, I think these will continue to kind of roll off, and provinces like Quebec, Ontario, and BC will follow the others. The challenge that we have in the healthcare system in this country is too immense, and it needs to be tackled. And we need everybody who can, and who wants to participate and be part of the system and part of the solution. We can't really afford at this point to start sort of pushing those folks to the side. I think we've gotten to a point now where it's quite serious, and there are bigger issues at play and more discussions to be had between the provinces and the feds. But it starts with getting people into those jobs as soon as possible.
Welcome back. We're continuing with our current events panel. We have Brock Stephenson and Elliot Hughes. Usually when you see fashion ads, usually the big controversy is that, perhaps they used models too thin or too young. It seems that a lot of fashion houses are now, or retailers are now kind of wading into some of the more social issues. One here in Canada, Simon's, which is a very successful department store based out of Quebec, they featured euthanasia in their recent ad. And it featured a woman who actually had just recently been euthanized, Jennifer Hatch, from British Columbia, and was kind of talking about her journey. It was I have to say, it was a very beautifully artistic advertisement, but she chose to have herself killed by doctor-assisted suicide, by medical assisted suicide. Is this appropriate for a fashion housing? Is this the right messaging even, Elliot? I'll let you take the first stab at it.
I mean, I definitely don't think it is. I think it is kind of pretty bad that they would try to use this very emotional type of story to try and sell more clothing. That said, as you mentioned, it's a very artistic and it's a sort of a nicely made ad, and I would assume that the person who was involved in that understood why this was being done, and so participated in that in a in an open and willing fashion. But I find it a very odd choice, and I find it, particularly around an issue that is so contentious at the moment and is going through some growing pains at the moment, and it's just a very odd choice. And when I saw that and read the article about it and saw the news about it, I really shook my head and really had to wonder. This was a very poor attempt at trying to stand out in what is becoming, I guess, a crowded clothing market, and I just couldn't understand what they were doing with it, to be honest.
Well, I mean, perhaps they had some foresight because we're here talking about it on national television, and I've chatted with about half a dozen other people. So, I never paid much attention to that store before, being here in Ontario, but who knows? Brock, what is your take on this ad? Was that poor taste? Apparently, the woman, Jennifer Hatch, she actually wanted to live initially. What is your take on this?
First of all, I think the foolish ad campaign achieved its goal. We're talking about it. But secondly, one of the core problems with assisted suicide in Canada is the court forced Parliament to make a decision. Parliament failed to do this. Now, as Elliot mentioned, it's a growing issue, and it's a growing pool of Canadians that may be eligible for medically assisted suicide. And the lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to public services shouldn't be sufficient cause to end a person's life just because they're struggling. There should be supports in society to help people.
Yes, I agree. I mean, she mentioned that it was through lack of palliative care, a lack of supports and healthcare. She had a rare syndrome called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, connective tissue disorder. Not very many Canadians know about it, but very painful to live. And it's sad that, I guess, coming off our last segment when we're talking about healthcare, that our healthcare system wasn't able to meet her needs. And again, taking the euthanasia component aside, it was a beautifully artistic, very visually beautiful ad. Totally, I don't think it hit I don't know how one sells clothes featuring euthanasia. I really don't. Let's talk about another ad that came out. Balenciaga, which is a European fashion house. Distastefully, and if we can put up the image, then we will. But they featured children with teddy bears in bondage. Again, one of those, what were they thinking kind of things. Elliot, did you catch that ad?
I didn't look through it because I thought it was pretty weird. But again, I think it's accomplishing, particularly with this, at least I kind of understand a little bit more than the Simon's ad. A fashion house trying to be edgy, trying to stand out. It's a very competitive landscape. We are talking about it on a current affairs program in Canada. So obviously this has done something to kind of get that Balenciaga name out there. Most people probably didn't even know what that brand was. So, and then immediately they retract, they apologize, and they pull back. And so they felt it was probably worth it. This is a brainstorming session gone wrong, or maybe a brainstorming session that's gone very, very right for the brand.
Brock, what is your take?
I think the real problem is once the ad was condemned, leaders in the fashion industry and Hollywood celebrities were really slow to criticize. It took Kim Kardashian days to speak out. It took other fashion houses days to speak out. And as a result, it sort of shows that the whole industry is complicit in sort of pushing the boundaries, endlessly trying to promote itself and sell their product.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, yes, Hollywood and celebrities were slow to come out. You mentioned Kim Kardashian. Again, they said, we're going to reevaluate our relationship. It wasn't even really a condemnation. I found that shocking. The depiction of children associated in any way, shape, or form with bondage to me is a horrifying as a parent, especially. Well, we'll see how that fares for them. We're going to cut to commercial break. We'll be right back. Thanks again for joining me, gentlemen. We're churning through many of these issues. One stood out to me when we were kind of selecting them for the show. And one was that Quebec National Assembly, which is their provincial government, they passed a law, and it was unanimous. They passed a law to make that if you want to pledge an oath to the king, which is commonplace, that is now optional. You no longer have to do that. And the oath to the king, obviously King Charles, because Queen Elizabeth passed away. What do you think of this, Brock? Do you think this is reasonable in the Dominion of Canada?
Well, this is the first Canadian challenge to our new sovereign. It's no surprise it comes from Quebec. It's probably a typical response from Quebec. The Quebec Solidaire Party, which is one of the opposition parties, did their oath in private so that there was no evidence of it. And then the Parti Québécois refused until all the parties unanimously agreed to sort of roll over. Rightfully, monarchists and royalists are rightly outraged on this, but I don't expect it to go to any court to get it reinstated. Quebec's its own society in this country, and I don't think they like King Charles III as much as some of the other provinces do.
Elliot, do you think this is a slippery slope, that this is the first kind of step in the Making Canada a Republic movement?
I don't think it's the first step. I think it's the second, maybe the third one. I think the first one you saw was with Bill 96, the language law, where there was this sort of deafening silence from federal leaders in Ottawa, unwilling to stand up and take on that law and take on the Premier of Quebec, who happens to be very, very popular. And I think when it was being talked about and discussed in Quebec, it was around the last election. So people were a bit worried stepping into that. I don't think this is the last we've heard of this story. I think based on some of the legal folks who I've been reading about, who have taken a look at this, there could be a challenge. I don't know if it'll come from a politician, but it may come from some law corners of Canada. We'll see where it goes, because as you say, I do think this is a bit of a slippery slope. Because if you start deciding, what language you can speak or what language you can't speak, who you're giving your oath to and who you're not giving your oath to, what's going to come next. And I think we need to be careful that this doesn't go in too wonky a direction.
Well, it was very interesting as a layperson spectating, a non-Quebecer watching this, because in some ways I would suggest that Quebec is a very heavily regulated society. You think of Bill 21, you mentioned Bill 96, but yet here it's like, oh, well, all this is optional. We're not going to regulate this area of who you're going to make your oath to. And I just kind of found it a little contradictory. I mean, either here are the rules or here are not the rules to make something optional. Well, what else can they make optional then? What other oaths can one make optional? Do you think any other province, Brock, would follow suit in this regard? Are there any others with a Republican flair, or is this simply Quebec being Quebec, if you will?
In the short term, I don't think anyone else would follow them. It probably is Quebec being Quebec. Part of the problem may be the new king. Long may he reign, but the longer he reigns, the longer this problem will continue. I don't think he's nearly as popular as the heir.
Right. Okay. And then you have all the drama with the Sussexes, I'm sure, and that's not really adding very much. Let's talk about MP Raquel Dancho. She was ejected from the House, so she's a Conservative member of Parliament. Elliot, what happened there?
Well, she accused a Liberal MP of being a liar, and then you're not allowed to do that in the House of Commons. The Speaker asked for her to apologize and to sort of take that back. She refused, and then the Speaker ruled that she had to leave the House of Commons for the day, wasn't allowed to take part in any of the committee hearings for the rest of the day. And she was, given a rousing ovation by her fellow Conservative MPs on her way out. This is, we've reached silly season in Ottawa. This is the last couple of days before the House rises for Christmas. Conservatives are fighting the government on a number of bills and opposing the government on a number of bills, as they should be doing. This is a way for the government to stand out and to catch, people's attention, to get people's attention, because most people don't really know what's going on in Ottawa. So if you can stand out for a relatively minor statement or position or action, such as this, then that's what opposition parties are meant to do.
We have 20 seconds before commercial. Do you have anything to add to that, Brock?
I think the real challenge is the Liberal government struggled to come up with their gun policy, and they don't know which guns are actually dangerous versus which ones look scary. And they've got the Conservative MPs, social groups, hunter groups, Aboriginal groups angry at them.
Yes. Well, we'll have to see how that bill works its way through Parliament. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We again have a current issues panel with us, and joining us is Brock Stephenson, Conservative commentator, and Elliot Hughes from Summa Strategies. Let's talk about something that many Ontarians may have missed, but there was an alleged COVID breach, COVID vaccine data breach that few may have paid attention to because people are busy. It's Christmas time, people are getting shopping done and a lot of holiday parties. So apparently, tens of thousands of Ontarians may have been impacted by this data breach. Brock, do you want to start us off on this?
So 360,000 Ontarians had their data breached from the COVID database. I think it's another data breach problem that government suffers from. They're slow to acquire the technology to protect consumers' data, the public's data. Emails are out there, birth dates, Ontario health cards. You could easily steal someone's identity from that and open a bunch of bank accounts, all sorts of other stuff. The punishment for these nosy employees is going to be a little more than a slap on the wrist, and it's always insufficient. I think that's the real challenge, but it's just another example of society being so used to a data breach that we don't even pay attention anymore.
Well, that would definitely be very sad if we didn't pay attention. Now, when I did some investigation or further reading on this, it seemed that it was only those who booked COVID vaccine appointments through the online booking portal. So I guess it wasn't through the health card database, which has that vaccine information, but just the online booking portal. Is that correct, Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is never good. Whenever information and data gets out like this, it is getting more and more common. I guess two things that are positive. One, the vast majority, based on the reading I did around this, vast majority, I think, was just name and address with some of the information that got out, which is positive, and not anything more. And then the second piece of good news is that they found the people who did it. And this is not some sort of shadowy organization from beyond our borders. And it sounds like it was a bit of an inside job, probably trying to sell that data online. But at least they've identified the people, and we'll be following up. We'll see what the punishment is. But two good pieces of news, at least in something that isn't great overall.
And we've had privacy lawyers on this show before who said that one of the most valuable pieces of information on the black market is someone's name, date of birth, and health card number. So when I first heard, you read just the headline quickly of the story, and you're like, oh gosh, somebody is making billions of dollars off this. But as you just explained, Elliot, we further delve in. It's really names and phone numbers. So I guess there's a hope and anticipation that this won't be as widespread.
It might mean more duct cleaning calls that we all get, and asking if we need to, help with our, cleaning those things out, which I think everybody in Ontario, at least, are probably pretty sick and tired of receiving.
I know somebody with a duct cleaning business, and I said, did you ever consider maybe making an advertisement saying, I'm not that guy who calls you, we never call? I just wonder. But in all seriousness, there have been other breaches. There have been concerns in various provinces. I remember earlier on when they were collecting this data for COVID vaccination that there was concerns with QR code data breaches, especially out east. I believe Newfoundland experienced that. Are we going to be seeing more of this? Now that the dust is settling on COVID, are we going to be seeing a lot more of this data breach? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first time when people were getting vaccinated that this information was actually collected, really centrally collected by the federal government, by the provincial government, rather. Brock, do you want to take that on?
I think this is a challenge we're going to see going forward as we shift towards governments around the country and around the world pushing for digital IDs and more online data. There'll be more data to breach.
And Elliot, do you think there could be other nefarious uses for this kind of information? Somebody out there has a list of Ontarians who who signed up to have a vaccine appointment. So that gives a hot list of who has been vaccinated, or a partial list of who's been vaccinated in this province.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything, too terrible with that. But again, I'm not a criminal mastermind kind of trying to use this information to hurt Canada. But look, I mean, governments need to invest more in digital and security, on IT security and digital security. I mean, it's just not to the level that it needs to be in this country. And if we don't invest those important dollars, we're just going to see more and more of these data breaches, and then it could get really serious. This one doesn't sound like terrible, but it's a bad indicator for the future.
Okay, thank you both, gentlemen, so much, and I wish you all the best for Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays.
And that wraps up our last current issues panel for 2022, and we'll see you back with more issues in 2023. Merry Christmas.